Thank you so much, Mike, Jonathan. Too loud, is it okay? So it's a pleasure to be here. I was last giving a talk here about 19 years ago. And so it's great to be back. And when I talked last time, it was really just my memory research. So now I'm going to give you a progression of how I've moved on to some other topics. So my title has memory activation during sleep, and that's one of the main basic research ideas I'm going to work through. But now I'm working on how is that helpful to us for applications that might improve our the benefits of sleep that we have during waking. And sleep, of course, has many benefits. And I think I could turn it down here a little bit, if that's what you're looking. Does this make it softer, or is that the?
That's good.
Yeah, good. Thought it was too loud. So we know sleep is important, and it's becoming more and more clear all the different ways that it's important. And you kind of think about having good quality sleep as meaning, well, you get 7 or 8 hours, and you don't wake up too many times in the midst of that. You can count how many minutes of slow wave sleep you have if you have a nice sleep tracker of the various sleep tech that can do that. And these are some qualities of how sleep can be beneficial, but I really want to get beyond the simple questions of, well, how do you arrange your life to find 8 hours to fall asleep? How do you be sure you don't have too much caffeine late in the day, not too much alcohol, not too much exercise right before sleep, darkness? All these sleep hygiene things are important, but I'm actually not going to talk about sleep hygiene. I'm going to talk about, well, what's happening during sleep in your brain that we could understand and then make it work better and get some benefits from that. So how is it important? And it's really striking that, sleep and dreaming are such a critical part of the human experience, and yet psychology departments all over the place don't have anybody studying them. How can that be? We have to fix that, and I think there was a lot of prospects for sleep research in the 80s, and it kind of dwindled. It really didn't go anywhere, and I think we're kind of in a new era now where sleep and dream research can now join into the rest of cognitive neuroscience and be part of that bigger movement. So let me start with a little bit about, no forward slide movement. Where is my friend?
Oh, no.
Advance a slide for me.
You have to click on the slide once with the mouse.
Oh, I clicked on slide to mouse. Here's the mouse. I know about that. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned a couple of my mentors. So one of them was Larry Squire, and there I learned about this distinction that he started: declarative memory versus non-declarative memory. And I want to spend a moment on it because I've noticed that a couple of the other speakers in this series are really going to talk about consciousness. So I want to give you a perspective on consciousness from memory research, because we've been thinking about consciousness for a long time since this distinction came up. And there's the idea that declarative memory is the special type of memory that amnesic patients have trouble with, and that allows us to consciously recollect past experience, to in a sense relive a past experience, to bring that to mind with awareness. Whereas all these types of non-declarative memory work in different ways, different brain systems, some cortical, some subcortical, but don't come with the conscious experience of remembering. So therefore, we're going to ask the question, well, what is it about the declarative memory system that gives us this special ability? Because even in the non-declarative sense, you can have cortical processing that's improved as a function of prior experience, but without any conscious experience, implicit priming, for example. And it's these connections between the different regions. So the standard theory of consciousness from memory research is the cortical constellation theory. That's what I call it. And that just says this is what you need for a conscious memory experience. And by extension, any conscious experience. It's a function of the cortex, but the cortex is working in a particular way that's not the way it's working in unconscious memory. But all these things can be active in different parts of the region, different regions of the cortex doing different things simultaneously. And it can all happen in parallel. But that's not what's happening when you have this connected constellation that gives you a conscious experience. So that's a simple, ordinary description of the idea that the brain does plenty of things, many of which happen unconsciously. And it's only the special processing that links the cortical regions together, which, by the way, of course, the hippocampus is helpful for, that gives us this conscious experience. Okay, so now I've told you all about consciousness. We can move on from there to the main topic. And I wanted to, as I was thanking my mentor, one of my PhD advisors, Larry Squire, I was also blessed with a number of other great mentors, and in particular, these three, Hilliard, Kudis, and Mays, helped me with these my first study in cognitive neuroscience was on the DM effect, which is our term for neural measures of memory formation, and I'll walk you through that. You can see a set of stimuli, words, or in this case, faces from my Venice High School yearbook. You could have to look at these faces you've never seen before and try to remember who they are. And then we can give a memory test later, and then we can go back and categorize those faces, which ones were remembered later and which ones weren't. So this simple strategy allows us to then look at brain activity. If you look at ERPs, you can see that there's a response that's very similar for the first half a second. But after a half a second, there's a difference, this difference related to subsequent memory, sometimes called subsequent memory effect, same idea. And we can now understand some processing of memory formation. You can also see it in fMRI studies with my colleague here, Paul Reber, where you can see it, a few seconds later, that same processing in specific brain areas that are giving rise to memory. So it seems like a memory can be formed right at that moment. And I think one of the other things I wanted to point out here while I was thanking my mentors is I was just calling back into mind what life was like in the 80s studying EEG. And we had a very insular field. We went to meetings where ERPers went to and just did that. And so this is my opportunity to thank Mike Gazaniga, because when the Cognitive Neuroscience Society formed, it changed everything. And all of a sudden, we weren't just off by ourselves, but we got to mix with all the other cognitive neuroscientists and join this bigger community. And it really made a big difference to how we could think about our research and connect, neuropsych and neuroimaging and the ERP world. So thank you for that, Mike. So back to this idea about forming memories. Maybe you know about this idea of a flashbulb memory. So sometimes something very striking happens. You hear about 9/11, or you hear about some assassination, and later on, you remember exactly where you were when you heard that event. That's the flashbulb memory effect. It's like a flashbulb went off, and everything in your brain right then was just gone into permastore, so you can remember exactly what happens. Well, that's one theory from Bob Livingston about how it works. I think it's quite wrong. I think you never form a memory immediately. That's how memory works in the brain. Memory requires more than that. And so even though we're measuring with a DM something very important that happens at that point in time, that's not really sufficient to give us long-lasting memories. And let me give you an example of that, because what is it? A little after 4, if I ask you, well, what do you remember from today? From the moment you got up and all the things you've done, meals, people you talked to, ideas you've had, if I ask you to write that down, let's say it was the end of the day, and I said, write a journal entry in your diary. What do you remember? You could write, I don't know, how many could write 5 pages? I think there's a lot to say about what happened in one day. But how many pages could you write about today, 5 or 10 days from now? Or let me put it another way. What did you do 10 days ago? We went back, to the 15th of the month.
Oh, that was a big
What do you remember from that day? Maybe something, I think it's not 0. And with the right cues, you could get more. But as days pass, memories become more difficult to remember. So that's a function of memory. And why is that? It's because memories aren't instantaneously formed, but they require something to endure. And this is one of the key questions in memory research: what makes memories endure? And it is the case that what you do at that moment, when we record the DM with EEG, the elaborative coding you do at that point is pretty important. And if you don't do good elaborative coding, you're not going to establish a memory. But it's not the whole story at all. The main part of the story is practice. If you want to remember something, you have to practice. If you meet some new people and learn their names, you better practice that information a bit to be able to have that name when you need it later. So it's practice, and it can be unintentional or intentional. Both work. There are different types of practice. And that practice happens when you intentionally, consciously reactivate the information, but we also reactivate it unconsciously, and that's part of the rehearsal. That's part of the practice. The reactivation happens whether we intend it or not, whether we know it or not, and it happens in our sleep. And so that's the story that I want to tell you about. And here's the way to think about it. Standard idea, you form some memories, but then a consolidation process has to happen. We usually call that systems consolidation. Different brain systems are involved for declarative memories. And it's a transformation of the information. It's taking new information and integrating it with what you know, putting it all together, forming some new connections to make sense of the experiences of the day. So hopefully today's experience do make some connections, and you do actually store it so that 10 days from now you will remember some of that. But this consolidation process has to be part of that. And that'll lead to an enduring memory. And some of that's happening during sleep, not all of it, but during sleep is part of this process. Now, at least that's how we think about consolidation. And also we have a role for insight and creativity, I think, because this consolidation is all about making connections with across different ideas. They can be very novel connections. I think that's a storehouse of our creativity and insight, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So there's an adjacent issue right here. Now that I'm talking about memories during sleep, it's like often you go to sleep and then your alarm clock goes off and you wake up and you don't really know much about what happens. The first person perspective, maybe you know you had not a great night of sleep, or you did wake up, but you maybe remember a dream. You don't really have a lot of knowledge of what's happening during that period. And yet there's this other idea that maybe it's really important for learning. So we have this idea that's been around a long time. Can we learn while we're asleep? Can we just not have to put in the effort to learn, a new language? We can just pick it up on our sleep. Is that what I'm talking about? So that's the meaning of sleep learning. And I wrote an article for Scientific American that made the cover because they wanted to use this title, sleep learning, which is a little bit misleading, right? Well, let me say this, there's two types of sleep learning. So one type is acquiring new knowledge during your sleep. If you want to learn a new language, I'd recommend doing that while you're awake. You don't acquire much, but it doesn't mean nothing. There are some little tidbits of things we can learn during our sleep. So the other meaning of sleep learning, though, is learning continues after the initial acquisition of information, and it continues during your sleep. And so sleep is important to the learning process. And we understanding more about how memories are strengthened when our brains are offline during sleep. So that's the bigger part of the story. And it has this old history, right? I mean, we kind of laugh at the idea of sleep learning, that first type of sleep learning, that, you're not going to pick up a foreign language. And that's been around a long time. In literature, even from 1911, Huxley wrote about that, called it Hypnopedia. It was a cool way for the state to control people and get ideas into them to make society work well. It was on The Simpsons in Dexton's Laboratory, and here's a title of a cover of a magazine, I guess, called Mechanics Illustrated. It says, "Learn while you sleep. The small voice under the pillow can teach you anything from self-confidence to college math." So the idea was around in the 50s, as well as in the 1910s. And in 1927, there was actually a gadget, sleep tech from 1927, patented as the automatic time-controlled suggestion machine, marketed as the psychophone. You could record your own voice, giving yourself some self-confidence message or whatever it is you wanted to, have ingrained in your mind, and have it play back a few hours later while you were sleeping. Sold a lot of those, although the Depression kind of hindered it a little bit. And there was research on this idea. There was some research during these years, but maybe not the best research. One study I want to share with you was pretty amazing. It was this guy, Lawrence LeSean, and he was a college professor at William & Mary, and he went up to upstate New York and hung out in a summer camp for kids and identified kids that had this nail biting bad habit. And he apparently broke that habit in a subset, not in a control condition, which he had, but in the other condition, he played a recording about, nails taste bitter when you bite something over and over again on a recording, on a record player that he played, except when it broke down, and then he had to just say it out loud himself. So I think he was onto something, but he dropped that and wisely moved to some other field the rest of his career. But there is something there. But so what's the problem here? Well, we don't really know if the kids were asleep. So he got enough that. But maybe it's sleep, maybe it's not. And that was the problem with a lot of these studies in the 30s and 40s when people were thinking about this stuff. And then in 1956, Simon and Emmons came up with this paper that tried to do one of those studies, but now recording EEG. And they showed, well, if there's any sleep learning, it's happening when they wake up. So really, it's all bunk. And from that point on, people didn't study this. Or actually, I found out some sleep researchers did study it, but didn't tell anybody because they were too ashamed. So it was kind of a taboo thing. We called it in this paper with Udiet, a 50-year dark ages of this research. So not much was done, a smattering of things. And then 50 years later, now we're going back and saying, okay, we can do controlled experiments. What's possible when you play sounds to people while they're sleeping? There were theories during this time. One of my favorites is this theory in a book by Jonathan Winson, where he wrote about how dreams are maybe part of the story, but we're processing memories during sleep. We're using them to think about the issues that are bothering us in our life and working through things and storing memories better. And the hippocampal gating that he studied was part of that story. There were some findings. So Jonathan Winson studied hippocampal replay, and that was later demonstrated more clearly by Wilson and McNaughton. In 1994, they did this hippocampal replay, and I keep wanting to point with this button, but I'm just pointing with my finger. The rat's exploring an environment, and it's got these different places shown by the 4 colors, and when the rat's in each place, different cells will fire. So there seems to be a cell for each place, and you can see the sequence of cells firing corresponding to the rat moving in a place when he's awake. When the rat's asleep, you see the same order of firing. So it seems like it's a replay of the rat going through that same locomotion sequence. Maybe experiencing that, we don't know. But we know the hippocampus seems to be doing that, so it's called hippocampal replay, and it's suggestive of something happening. But at the time, the field was still confused about, well, is that connected to dreaming? Because that's what Winston thought, that's what most people thought. So there's this question, well, should we be looking at these replay phenomena during REM sleep or in slow wave sleep? The results are kind of different in the 2 different cases, and some clarity arose in 2007. There was a trend through those few years around that time to say, actually slow wave sleep is where the meat is. We really have to be looking at slow wave sleep. And this is one study that really changed our thinking about that to focus the evidence, because with REM sleep, the results, they just weren't very consistent. Maybe REM has something to do with remembering some thought, like Crick thought. Maybe it has something to do with forgetting. It was, nothing really made sense here, but it did start making sense with the studies of slow wave sleep. So what Bjorn Rasch and his colleagues did is they had people learn spatial information on a screen with an odor context, the odor of rose flowers. And then when they were asleep, they went through these normal cycles of light sleep and deep sleep, and then REM, and then repeat. And during different periods, in this case, during slow wave sleep, they presented the odor again. So the person's asleep, they don't know they're getting the odor, but nevertheless, the odor is present. And when they wake up, they are performing better on this test if they've gotten the odor both during learning and during slow wave sleep, not during REM sleep, didn't work there. So during slow wave sleep, you get a benefit. You could call it less forgetting if you get an odor during the sleep than if you don't. So this showed actually slow wave sleep seems to be more important for memory than REM sleep. And it showed we have a way to modify it to not just look at correlative data, but actually manipulate what's going on. So when we saw this in my lab, we thought, hey, let's go after that. And we didn't know any better. We said, let's use sounds because we don't have odors handy. So we did the same study with sounds, found the same sort of effect. That's the paper Mike was mentioning. And I'll walk you through what we did. And the idea was memory activation during sleep seems to change storage. So the rodent literature was just saying those cells fire again, but it wasn't telling us, is that part of the consolidation process? Does it actually change memory storage? These results tell us that there's a change. And so the steps to get there were, one, to not be talking about new learning, like learning a new language while you're asleep with no effort at all, but rather to build on what you've learned while you're awake. So one orientation that's important. It's about consolidation. It's not about sleep learning in the traditional sense. There was also this dogma that sensory information is blocked during sleep, maybe with the one exception of odors. And if it works, I'm going to try a video that demonstrates that people in the field really believe that sounds don't get in while you're asleep. But it may or may not work. This is Matt Walker, my buddy Matt Walker, who talks about sleep, and not quite working, but I will try another method, which is to click on it. No, I can't see them now.
Yeah. Hey, there you go. Yes, sir.
I don't see them now.
It's right.
You can see it on the screen.
Yeah.
No, I still don't see it.
Just head down.
Go down.
Tell me to go left or?
Right there, Brian.
A little to the left.
So this is about being a Mac user and having to use a PC where your bills don't work, right? But I will tell you what Matt said. It's not gonna work. So Matt said, everybody knows that the sensory pathways are blocked during sleep. Your ears are working, but none of the information gets to the cortex because it's cut off at the thalamus.
There we go.
Okay. We will.
Oh, you
I
said
think
it
it
takes,
was about
you said
to
it
start.
takes a moment to
Yeah.
start.
Yeah. Let me try it one
You can take my word for it.
If you have other videos, we can solve the technology on this. Okay.
Thank you. Brandon.
If you leave the slide mode, it's really easy to find it. Just escape from
Oh,
this.
that's one way. You can do that.
No, I can't tell.
Can I see the mouse though? Still can't see it.
I can make a change, so we.
You've got an invisible mouse. Anyway, so he says that, and I'm not picking on Matt. He has this great book about sleep. He's just saying what every sleep researcher taught, that sounds don't get in unless they're really loud. And then like an alarm clock, you'll wake up. But otherwise, the information has no chance. So don't try to do sleep learning. It's just not something that's gonna happen. So that was the orthodox view. It was wrong. Sounds do get in, they make a difference. Now, my third point on this slide was, okay, so we're looking at slow wave sleep, not REM. So that was another important insight. And we have methodological advances that can manipulate brain activity during sleep. So we can expand on that, but one of those is playing sounds to remind you of spatial information that you learned. We can also change the oscillations in the brain by training oscillations. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So that's the background. Next, I'm going to tell you about, on the next slide, about how that paradigm actually ran. So it was like Bjorn Rash's study. There's spatial learning that you start at the beginning. And to start it out, you have to learn where a bunch of objects are on the screen. And so you'll.
All right.
It moved off the screen again.
That's the problem. Eric was telling me this.
Okay, I can tell you about it without the slide. So the first part of the procedure is learning. They learn objects on a location, on a background. There are 50 different objects. Each object has a unique sound. So the cat has a meow sound. Each object has a sound that goes with it. They don't have to learn the sounds. They know which sound goes with each object. They just have to learn where each object is. They do a number of practice trials, get feedback. They get better and better. They learn where the 50 objects go. And then they're in the lab, and in the afternoon, Northwestern students are used to sleeping in the afternoon in a dark room. So they have a nap. So the next part of the experiment, the second part is they go to sleep. We monitor their EEG with the standard polysomnographic methods. And we can see them go from wake to non-REM stage 1, stage 2, and then they're into slow wave sleep. Yeah, so slow wave sleep shown in purple is where we quietly present some of the sounds, and we randomly pick 25 of the sounds matching, at least with a matching procedure. Half of the sounds get presented, and we're just asking, do those sounds get in and change memory storage at all? And the sounds aren't what they have to remember. They don't have to remember meow. They have to remember, where was that cat on the screen? And so the last part is memory tests. They have to know where each object is, and they point, and we can measure to the pixel how accurate they were. So it's a nice measure. It's a recall measure with precision about how accurate you are. And the result was, as I showed you in the prior slide, that there's less forgetting if they got a sound. And this is a within subject design. So same subjects, in this case, the half of the objects that weren't reactivated during sleep and the half that were. So the only explanation here that makes sense to me is that the sounds must have gotten in, made the person reactivate the representation of the object and the object's location so that that location was less likely to be forgotten when they woke up. So an improved memory. And we presented the sounds just once each time because we were a little fearful of waking the people up. So we had to present the sounds in a white noise background without them being too loud, so no one would wake up, which turns out to be quite important. And this not only tells us that memory activation during sleep changes memory storage, but it gives us a handle on now measuring the physiology of that, which I'll allude to a little bit. I won't go into great detail on that, but it's pretty interesting. Let me tell you that the effects are replicable. So this one study in Science with not enough subjects, you really shouldn't believe it. But now I can say, it turns out repeated studies have shown that this happens, in a meta-analysis by Xiaosheng Hu with about 100 studies showed that there's a believable effect there with different types of memory, not always spatial memory, other types of memory work as well. And that's the fun thing about it being a memory researcher, is you can study all types of different sorts of things that people remember. And it seems that the TMR effects works for a lot of those. I will give you some examples, but all these studies also show that, well, there's some factors that change the results you get. I mean, you're not going to get a good result if your memory measure is noisy, doesn't have good sensitivity, ceiling effects and whatnot. And sleep disruption is also a critical factor that I want to underscore. It's interesting that the German government is now funding a study by my colleague, Gordon Feld, to replicate this experiment, the same one, in a bunch of different labs. So a bunch of labs will be doing this afternoon nap study with the same spatial task. And I'm crossing my fingers they replicate the design. I'm pretty confident about that. What I think is we'll learn some new things because we'll have a larger data set to be able to explore. So I'm pretty excited about that. Here's one of our newer studies. It's the same kind of design. Now it's face memory. So people had to learn the names and faces that went with them. So this is Tyler Smith. You see the face, you have to learn that so the next time you see that face, you can recall the name, just like you might need to in your life. During sleep, we wait till they're in slow wave sleep. We present very quietly the names of half of the people they've learned. And then test memory later. This was work by my graduate student, Nathan Whitmore. So that's not actually Tyler, that's Nathan in the slide. But he ran a study and showed a benefit. Face name learning improved. There were better performance on recalling the name. And he found something else that we didn't expect. He found that if you looked at sleep disruption, at the moment we presented the sound, to the extent that there was sleep disruption, there was no longer a benefit for memory. So it turns out this method only works if you can do it without bothering someone's sleep, without moving them out of slow wave sleep, or even without producing EEG signals of arousal. So that's a pretty important message that the meta-analysis didn't quite get us, because people don't always look at the measures of sleep disruption. In fact, we try to do our experiments so we get none. And that's one of our challenges of doing these experiments in the home, because we're not there to watch to be sure the sounds aren't going to wake people up. And yet we can still make this work in the home. Oh, Nathan did one other experiment in his dissertation, which is he said, well, let's do the experiment again, but let's intentionally make the sounds too loud. I thought that was a lousy idea, but he went ahead and it turned out pretty interesting, because then he showed, yes, that actually impairs spatial recall. So if you want to forget something, you can present a sound for it too loud that doesn't quite wake you up, it's disruptive. And then that memory seems to be worse when you wake up. And the third study in this dissertation was this at-home TMR. So Nathan figured out a way to use Fitbit data that comes out of the Fitbit. So not using the Fitbit scoring method, but taking the raw data and estimating whether someone's in slow wave sleep and then presenting the sounds from the phone app so that they can do this whole experiment in the home. And he showed that it doesn't work if you wake people up, which he did in his first experiment. And the second one, he tweaked things and it showed that he could get the memory advantage. And the sounds we think are presented during slow wave sleep, we use EEG monitoring to try to verify that. This is cut out now. Is that B or is that
Move it down
the way it works? Slower.
under your chin, so I think it's, you're losing it.
Okay, how's that?
That's worse.
Put it down a bit more. Okay, so how can we look at the physiology of all this? There's a lot to say about this, a lot of new studies from many labs, but I wanted to just give you an example from Eitan Schlecksman, who was a postdoc with me now. He's a professor at UC Irvine, and he did a number of cool experiments. In this one, he did TMR with our standard spatial task. He used a round instead of a square grid, but it was the same spatial task. And the other tweak he made is each sound wasn't associated necessarily with one object. Sometimes it was associated with 2 objects, sometimes with 6 objects. So there could be 6 cats. You had to learn all the locations of the cats, and they all got reactivated and studied when you heard the meow. So the meow comes in and it's related to 6 things. And what he found is that you got a memory benefit that was just as big with 6 as in 2 as in 1. So it wasn't like there was a limited resource of reactivation. It seems that this reactivation happens in parallel, like unconsciously. It can activate all these cat locations and improve your memory for them just as well as if there was only 1 cat location. So that was interesting. He also looked at the physiology. So that's the main point here. This is a time frequency plot. So this is time 0 when the sound was presented during sleep. And then the few seconds after that and different frequencies. And this red band here is the low slow wave band. So or delta band. So we're seeing an increase of delta activity within the first second after the sounds are presented. And then after that, there's a activity in this higher band, which is the sleep spindle band, an important sleep physiology measure. And so there's both a slow wave and a spindle increase. And those are 2 of the critical components that many studies have shown are correlated with memory processing and seem to be reflecting some of that critical processing. And he actually showed that with the 6 objects, you get a much stronger effect. That's stronger than 2, which is stronger than 1. So even though the memory effect is the same for the 3 conditions, the physiology was a lot bigger. More seemed to be happening in the slow wave and spindle band as a function of this. So this is a picture of the 3 of the critical physiological measures during sleep that relate to memory processing. So I measured the slow waves shown in red, the spindles in blue, and there's also ripples that can be recorded from the hippocampus, studied extensively in animals. This is the oscillatory trinity that's been described, the 3 critical features. And it's not that you have to have all 3 of them alone, it's that they actually are coordinated. So their relative timing, their coupling is a critical feature of everything working well. So you need to have slow wave sleep, you need to have those slow waves, you need to have spindles that are tied to the right phase of the slow waves for this to work optimally. And I'm not going to go into details of that, but that's pretty interesting, a kind of foot in the door of understanding how this all works. And with my colleague Phyllis C., who's a sleep researcher and sleep doctor, knows all about sleep disorders, we've been studying ways to try to enhance those oscillations, in particular the slow waves, but also the spindles. And we can do that with electrical stimulation, but also with more safe, probably auditory stimulation at those frequencies to make those better. And there are, small improvements in those oscillations and in memory function when this is done. So it's a hopeful method that, if improved a bit more, could be one way of sleep engineering, one way of getting sleep to be better. Another part of the physiology is to actually look inside the brain, because I mentioned those three things, and the slow waves and the spindles you can see on the scalp. But if you want to see the ripples, you need electrodes inside the brain. And so we had this opportunity from my grad student, Jessica Creary, working at the University of Chicago to study intracranial data while people were doing the same spatial learning experiment with the TMR method. And so here, electrode contacts in or near the hippocampus in a group of 5 patients, which is what we could get, but the results were quite consistent. And I'm not going to emphasize this, but this is another time frequency plot of a comparison between the sounds we presented that came from our task versus other matched sounds that weren't in the task. We saw a lot larger responses in these 3 bands, theta, sigma, and gamma. And there was also a DM effect in there, that the gamma activity was stronger for the ones that would be improved as a function of those sounds presented during sleep. So again, another hint on this physiology that unwinds every time we hear those sounds. And then by extension, I figure the same physiology is happening when you don't present sounds, when you're activating information every night, you're bringing up this physiology that we can perhaps study better and understand how it works more. What I want to emphasize from this study, though, is the behavior. The behavior was pretty interesting in a couple ways. And so these are the data from the 5 separate patients, and it's showing the 2 conditions, the objects that they learned equally well in 2 cases, but in one case, they got that sound of that object during sleep on the left, and the right, they didn't get the sound. And what's plotted on the y-axis is how much they forgot from the evening until they were tested again the next morning. And so you can see they tend to forget, but they definitely forget more if they didn't get the cue during sleep. So the cues during sleep make memory better, and in some cases, actually even better than it was before they went to sleep. So we sometimes see these improvements in memory as a function of presenting it. And this was quite clear in all 5 of the patients, so a very consistent result. So that's how we could get away with N of 5 in a PNAS paper. They sort of were nice to us and didn't push us to get more, because it's pretty hard work. That's the number of patients Jessica could get. Actually, it wasn't the number. There were 9. So there were these 5. But there were another 4 that we couldn't record the hippocampal physiology. Why? Because there was lots of seizure activity, because in that's what's expected. They're having seizures, their drugs are pulled, they're going to have the seizure activity. And so we couldn't do the hippocampal analysis in those other 4. But we could do the behavior analysis. So we went and looked and said, okay, because in fact, Jessica didn't know they were having seizures, because it wasn't a seizure, it was epileptiform activity that was restricted to the hippocampus, kind of looked like, I was going to tell you a bit more. I'm going to skip that. So it kind of looked like this, big epileptiform activity in the hippocampal contacts. But on the scalp, you don't see that. And she was looking on the scalp to just see, are they in slow wave sleep? Should I present the sounds? Are they waking up? Should I make them softer? All that. So she didn't notice it, but we looked later. And it turns out there was an interesting effect that's reminiscent of the forgetting I was talking about. So it's not that the sounds didn't work. The sounds actually had the opposite effect in these patients. So we presented half the sounds, and those sounds now on the left were all, the objects associated with the sounds were forgotten compared to the ones we didn't cue. So we actually changed memory. We just changed it in the opposite way. So another idea is if there's something in your life you want to forget, like in this film, there isn't a magic machine that does that. The memory is distributed across the cortex. How could you find the spot? The memory isn't in one spot, it's distributed about. But it turns out the hippocampus knows where it is. So if you present the sound and reactivate that memory, and then the hippocampus spews out garbage from that epilepsy, those seizure activity, then you kind of degrade the memory and you get forgetting. So I think this is interesting for a number of reasons. Some clinically, like some epilepsy patients complain of memory impairment, and they get neuropsych, and the doctor says, actually your memory is just fine, no problem. So what is the neuropsych test? It's testing at a 30-minute delay at most, and they can ace that. Some patients have something that's been called accelerated long-term forgetting, and their memory is bad if you wait a few days or a week. And that's what they're complaining about in their life. They're saying, I forgot what happens last week. Maybe it's my epilepsy, and it's no help for the doctor to say, no, your memory's fine. That's not what they want to hear. Actually, I think something is wrong. Normally, for the rest of us, our slow wave sleep is helping our memory get better. and reactivating memories that pop up. Because what's happening during sleep, where our mind's wandering, and it's wandering to recent memories that have happened, and reactivating those and connecting them to other memories and doing consolidation. And in these patients with epileptic seizures limited to the hippocampus, they're reactivating memories and then scrubbing them and having more, getting worse as a function of how much slow wave sleep they get. So that's kind of critical to understand their clinical syndrome. So moving ahead, because I'm running out of time, there are other types of memory to study too. You can study Guitar Hero, or a spatial learning in the form of a motor skill learning task where you have to press buttons as a function of little circles going up on the screen. And if we cue and when you press it, you hear a melody. As you learn to do it better, you get better at playing that melody. If we play the melody during sleep, people wake up better able to perform that Guitar Hero test, pressing buttons at the right time. Another example is a type of implicit processing. So if we try to change someone's implicit social bias, either on race or gender, we can give them a little training that counteracts the bias that they've acquired through their life. Counteracts it a little bit, it's a temporary effect. And what we showed here is that if we remind you of that training during sleep, then the reduction in bias is bigger rather than going back to your normal level of bias. So we think this can work for reactivation is important for skill learning, for skills, for habits, and unconscious priming as well, and like all the different types of memory that are on this standard chart of memory processing on the right. So therefore, it could be used in a lot of cases. And in one study we're in the process of doing, we're studying stroke patients that are getting rehab in their home to try to use their arms better. They're having trouble controlling their arm movements. And as a function of the stroke, they can get some rehab training to get better. And we're asking if we remind them of that training every night, can they learn quicker and develop better? Another example is, that's the example I was just talking about, motor skill training with Mark Slutsky. The top example is PMR method has been used by my colleagues in Geneva. Sophie Schwartz showed that with sounds, they could help people in the treatment for nightmare disorder by using sounds as part of the clinical treatment. And we're looking at that as well. And in the broader sense, I think now that we can use TMR to reactivate memories, we can try to think about how to reactivate positive memories to change the course of your sleep, to change your mind from an anxious, depressed, focused thinking mode to other things that we can reactivate, like a meditation or a relaxation context to reactivate those sort of things. So these are studies we're kind of thinking about. How can we change people's breathing, their muscle control, their bruxism, and their mental state of the type of things that are, So memory, sleep is a function, sleep quality is a function of how much slow wave sleep you get, but also which memories you bring up and how do those affect you. And do you wake up in the morning on the right side of the bed or the wrong side of the bed? Perhaps the function of which memories you reactivated overnight. But creativity is the other one I wanted to hit. So how has creativity benefited from sleep? Everyone knows the stories of, Paul McCartney got some ideas about yesterday and woke up with the idea of benzene ring. There are plenty of stories like that. But here's some data that's not anecdotal to show that it happens by this study by Christian Standards, to have people do these problems, like look at those circles and move 3 of them to make the triangle point down and up instead of up. And so she gave people a few minutes. Many people didn't solve the problem. Here's a solution for you. But her goal was to find problems they failed to solve. So for every person, she found 6 problems they couldn't solve in the evening sessions. They had these puzzles. Each puzzle had a sound track that went with it. So the 6 puzzles are there. They failed to solve them. And then in the evening, sleeping in their home with a wireless EEG monitor we gave them, they got 3 of the soundtracks during sleep. So our question was, could we reactivate those problems? And think about it this way, if you are working on a problem in your social life or your work life, and you want a solution, you should use your sleep to get there. We can solve more problems if we did this. And that's what happened here. When they woke up, they tried to solve the problems, and the results were, if we didn't cue them, 20% of the problems could be solved in the morning. It went up to over 30% if we had cued those problems. So And this is, so it's a different thing. We're not saying your memory for the problem is better. We're saying somehow by processing that memory during sleep, you're more likely to avoid the dead end and get to the solution of the problem and answer the problem. So I think there's scope for using our sleep better for insight and creativity as well. And this is sort of our one example of that. Now I want to end with studies of evening. And so if we reactivate a memory during sleep, it could be a memory of reality monitoring. The reality monitoring is thinking about the present moment and deciding carefully, do this if you like. Am I awake right now? Or am I dreaming this whole seminar? You can ask yourself that. And we link that to a sound. We play a little beep, beep, beep with that. And every time we play the beep, you get into the habit of thinking carefully about your experience. And then when you're in REM sleep, we can play that sound again. And we give the instruction, if you're in a dream and you know it's a dream, in other words, you're having a lucid dream, signal us back by moving your eyes left and right, left and right. So we do this TMR, we call it targeted lucidity reactivation. So instead of a memory, we're trying to get you in a lucid state. We play the sound and we can see a signal. This is the left, right, left, right. It's really obvious. I mean, in slow wave sleep, you see eye movements, but you never see exactly this kind of movement. So it really stands out. And this is the person telling us, I know I'm asleep in your lab and I'm dreaming, and here's my signal to prove that, and now I'm going to go off in my dream. So now that we have this method to produce lucid dreaming, and we can do it in some people who never had a lucid dream before, this method has provoked them into having lucid dream. So lucid dreaming is hard to study, it's kind of rare. Maybe half of the people in the world have had it or something like that, and not very often at that. But now we can make it happen in the lab. Now finally we can have a literature on that and study it in more detail than has been done in the past. And so that's one thing we did. And in 2001, my student Karen Conkley and a host of others published this paper where we used that method. So now that we had people lucid dreaming, we could go further and say, can we find out about their dreams? Because they can signal us. So we're using signals and we're using our auditory input to ask questions to them. So here's an example of some EEG. On the left, you see wake, and then in red is a period of REM sleep. You can tell it's REM. The EEG has changed. The muscle activity is very low. The eyes are moving around, and this is a signal. It's a left, right, left, right, left, right. And it's the person telling us, the person was Chris, and Chris is telling us, I'm having a lucid dream right now. I know I'm in your lab dreaming, and I'm having a dream, and I'm ready for you to ask me a question. So we knew we were going to ask him math questions. He didn't know which math questions, but a random question was picked. Susan pressed the button. 8 minus 6 was the question. At that point, the question came. And then following that, he answered using a code. 2 left rights means 2. He answered 2, he got it right. There was another question, another correct answer. So he was able to hear the question correctly in his REM sleep, remain in his dream, understand the question, do a computation, get the answer, give us the answer. So we don't want to study math in sleep, but it was a method for us to show that the method could work, to demonstrate that the questions actually get in and are answered correctly. And we didn't know it was going to work. It was an adventure, but pleasantly it worked. And our results were published together with results from 3 other labs who had actually done the same kind of thing, 1 before us and 2 after us. And we published it all together from 4 different countries. So now here's a little scheme of how that works. So you can be recording the EEG, see the signals, the person is dreaming something, they can receive the signal. In the French group, they did it with tapping as well. So you can do it with somatosensory stimulation. And you can use lights as well. You can get output from eye movements. Also muscle twitches sometimes work, not as consistently. And the method we like the best now is sniffs. So we have people sniff. Sniff 3 times. That can mean something if we give them that code in advance. They can't talk to us because they're paralyzed, because they're in REM sleep, but they can communicate with their respiration and their eye movement control. And therefore now we can ask what's happening in their dreams. And so those are the newer experiments. Karen is just finishing 1 paper on whether what's their visual experience like during sleep when they close their eyes. And we're ready to ask more questions about what happens during sleep. So I think now we have a whole new way to get at sleep and a dreaming that can connect to memory consolidation during sleep and what's the role in dreams in that. and all we understand from these studies in under neuroscience. So we have a lot more to try to ask, what are dreams about and how are they useful for us? Part of that work is taking advantage of a Tibetan Buddhist practice, because the Buddhist practitioners have a history of using their sleep for their own benefit and for the benefit of others. And they do that by essentially meditating in their sleep. But their meditation is a kind of contemplative, analytic meditation. They can basically engage in certain activities intentionally during their lucid dreams. And so we're studying them to try to understand, how do they do that? How can we understand those methods better? How can we make use of those to understand dreaming better and to perhaps come up with interventions that other people could use? So that's a new work on what's called dream yoga. It's a mental practice, not a physical practice that people engage in during their sleep. And in concert with that, I've been involved in teaching neuroscience to monks, because it turns out the monks in certain Tibetan traditions want to add neuroscience to their methods. They want to understand how the mind works, and they realize that neuroscience is one important method to understand how the mind works. So that bringing that together with their Buddhist philosophy. And so in the course of teaching the monks how to do neuroscience and how to do their own experiments, we're collaborating. And one of our collaborations is on the studies of dream yoga, where we can get experts who have engaged in that practice for many years to see what they can do in their sleep. So I think I should wind up, because I see the clock ticking towards the hour. So to summarize, I think there are a lot of future uses of what we could call sleep engineering that I've been talking about. And I've emphasized understanding sleep physiology and how it's important for memory consolidation. I think it's important in dreaming, yet to be understood, still very mysterious. But I think these things contribute to our well-being when we wake up, so could be very important. Therefore, we have ideas of interventions for people. One of the projects we're working on is to just use the standard TMR method with the Fitbit and the phone in the home. But now for people at a higher age, or maybe in early stages of memory decline, and we can't cure their memory problem that way, but perhaps there's some specific information they'd like to remember better, like the names of their grandchildren. And we could then say, target those and try to help them remember those things better. That's one potential use. And we piloted in young people, and it seems that we can, in fact, improve memory for names that way. So we're moving ahead with that. And it really applies to other therapies that are used. Many therapies are about learning. The stroke therapy is about learning. There's prospects for applying this in different ways. We've done some work on patients with MCI to show that their memory their memory problems are perhaps related to their poor sleep. And so that's been known that there's poor sleep in Alzheimer's patients in this early stage. That seems to also be the case. And therefore, with my colleague Phyllis, we've been looking at how to improve that. So if we can improve the delta activity, which seems to be correlated with memory with the sensory entrainment method, that could be helpful. That's sort of still work ongoing. So I mean, the method is there. Its effects are small, so we have to understand it better and see if we can enhance them. It could be important for removing amyloids. That's a pretty enticing idea that folks that have been studying the lymphatic system suggest that could be really critical to data. The jury's still out on that, but I think that makes it really interesting as well to improve sleep. And Carmen Westerberg, my former postdoc, is now also working on people who have excellent memory. And it turns out those excellent memory people, their sleep's pretty normal. But with one exception, their spindle activity seems to be really high. And so we're trying to explore the spindles and understand how the spindles are important for all of us and how maybe people that have excellent memory really make better use of their sleep. That could be part of the secret of their ability. Okay, my third point, I've already touched on this. Can we improve sleep quality, both in the physical sleep habits, progressing through the different stages of sleep, and also through the mental activity that seems to be beyond our control during sleep? If you're having stressful sleep, is it really beyond our control? Maybe not. And then using lucid dreaming for various goals. That was the fourth one that I touched on just at the end. So I'd like to have some time for questions. So let me thank my various mentors and collaborators. We've done, one of the benefits of those is to integrate more with the animal research, because I think it's the animal research that's gonna figure out the details of that physiology of the spindles and their coupling with the ripples and so forth. So I think that is a fine goal for animal research, and I'd be happy to collaborate with people that want to do that. I don't think I'm gonna start doing that, but yeah, I think that would, you know, I think their opportunities are really there for understanding the physiology better and then understanding ways to make it work better. Studies because it's so much easier to do. And we're interested in slow wave sleep, and in the afternoon, you can get a good amount of slow wave sleep in many people. When we're interested in REM sleep, though, we have to study a different time of day. So overnights are the way to do it. And so, yes, I think our nap result generalized is sleep, but yes, afternoon sleep is different from overnight sleep. And the sequence of stages, I mean, going from light sleep to deep sleep to REM sleep, you don't quite do that many times during a nap. You might not even get to REM sleep, but you do it overnight. And it's a little mysterious why that's beneficial, but one thinks that it must be. So there are important differences. Yeah. Yeah, we haven't done enough. There aren't enough longitudinal studies like that. I guess you're talking about individual differences. So
Yes.
probably there are individual differences. We haven't studied them that much. It's pretty interesting to think that some people are better learners because they pay attention well and get information in. And some people are better learners because their sleep works better than others. And you know, that's kind of been off the radar, right? If that's part of the story, and I think it is, and it is in the patients with MCI, for example. Yeah. What I can say is that people are not good at understanding that that happened. So they don't know they got sounds, and if we give them a forced choice saying, which sounds do you think you might have gotten, there a chance. So it seems like there's no knowledge, but I wouldn't rule out something more subtle that we haven't measured yet. On the other hand, when we do this in REM sleep, there is knowledge. I mean, Chris, when he did that study, he woke up and said, well, I made my signal for lucidity. You presented me 8 minus 6, I signaled 2. That's sleep learning. I mean, he woke up with an episode that came from part of the stuff that came outside through his senses. So he learned some things. So he was conscious of what that happened. So I think that the REM state is quite different from the slow wave sleep state. And I'm not willing to guarantee that slow wave sleep is without consciousness. I think perhaps the slow waves are not conducive to consciousness, but nevertheless, maybe there's some information that can leap from before a slow wave to after it to maintain some information. So we don't quite know how that's coded. And so at a first approximation, it seems that TMR during slow wave sleep is without the person knowing that it's happening. And by the same token, every night when you're sleeping and I'm sleeping, I think there's a lot of memory processing happening and we don't know about it. So I think that's kind of the first way to think about it for now. Yeah. We haven't. There's a group at MIT that has, so there's a little work on that. I think you're totally right. It's an interesting other state. It's a little trickier to study because you're kind of on the verge of being asleep or awake. But it's nonetheless very interesting about how that happens. And I think maybe it's like REM in a lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah. We're working on that. So we have an app. We could try it out. We think it's going to work better when we link it with better measurements of sleep. So the app, the first 1.0 version played 6 hours after you went to sleep. Maybe you were in REM. Worked a little bit. Now we're doing it with Fitbit, trying to target REM. That works a little bit better. next thing I'm gonna do with EEG headbands, target it a little better, so I think it's coming down the pipe. Sorry, I missed you before. And can we get you to sleep quicker? Can we get you to progress through the sleep
Well,
stages
it's
quicker? It's kind of sci-fi, but I
Not
think
just progress, but stay asleep.
And stay asleep
That's
longer.
a bigger problem as you get.
that's
older.
kind of hard. I'm not sure how we're gonna do that, but I think that would also be the hope of keeping people asleep. And waking up during your REM periods, that's really not a good idea. That's seen in certain emotional disorders, so you want to have continuous, consistent sleep without microarousals. But we all have microarousals. I mean, we all wake up periodically during sleep and we forget those. We don't realize it happens. You have to be in a sleep lab to actually see the microarousal, because those are not stored in memory. So there seems to be quite a lot of forgetting.
So is there a relationship between, less good memory as you get older and
Yeah.
less?
That our sleep is worse, our memory is worse, and in amnestic MCI, that's even exaggerated more. The causal link is a little harder to say. I think there's some link, but certainly in Alzheimer's disease, there's other problems that aren't just in sleep that are making the system not work. So my orientation was, I think sleep contributes to it. And so I think it probably contributes to age-related memory dysfunction as well. Yeah, we haven't quite done that enough, but I think exactly that is probably happening. There is some retrieval-induced inhibition. And we actually ran an experiment in collaboration with Mike using this kind of forgetting manipulation and couldn't quite enhance forgetting in that method. But I think those kind of ideas make perfect sense. We need to do more work on this. Yeah. Part of what you're saying is kind of countering the idea of sleep engineering. You're saying evolution has already done a good job. It's fine. Why can't we just go with that? I mean, we use these things. Evolution hasn't gotten us everything. So I think possibly we can make sleep better. But people who are lucid dreamers sometimes say they don't feel as rested after a lot of lucid dreaming. So perhaps there is a kickback against the restorative benefits of sleep. So we're always concerned, even with TMR, do we mess up the restorative benefits of sleep? We don't want to do that unless the benefit's really there. In our stroke study, the patients want to gain control of their arms and, be able to eat more easily with that arm. So I think we're willing to take some costs. So I think same with lucid dreaming. I mean, if there's a benefit, then you have to weigh it against the cost. We're not sure there's much cost, but we should be on the lookout for, is there a cost for both the TMR and the lucid dreaming? So, yeah. Dream yoga idea is not just to have fun in your dreams, but use those insights to change your waking life and become lucid, become waking life. So that's exactly the idea.
Dreaming seems like a good place to heal.
I think it's pretty powerful because it's, I think we're doing virtual reality experiments and they're pretty fun. And seeing how they connect to dreaming. But dreams are like the original virtual reality. It's so real, you think you're awake, and I think therefore there's opportunities there. Perhaps connecting with ideas that are blocked a little bit, that you're not quite conscious of during your wake.